In AD 797, the theologian Alcuin wrote a letter to the Bishop of Lindisfarne wherein he scolded the monks for their interest in telling heroic, heathen stories. In the letter he asked, "Quid enim Ingeldes cum Christo?" What has Ingeld to do with Christ? Alcuin's response is unsurprising, given that for many in the Middle Ages, and even today, Christianity was capital T, truth, and heathenism was complete capital F, falsity. The monks' actions, however, reveal that for some, if not many, the two belief systems existed on an intertwined continuum, one intersecting with the other at more than one point on the line. And since the inception of modern Germanic scholarship, academics from Tolkien to Levine to Bolton have spilled much ink attempting to reconcile Ingeld to Christ. Many of these scholars have also argued, either directly or indirectly, that the Beowulf poet, or more accurately now we know poets, crafted this famous poem as a rhetorical response to Alcuin. While these arguments may be quite convincing, our imperfect knowledge of the poem's exigence make these great words mere speculation. We do not fully know the poem's date of production, the scriptorium that produced it, nor the person who commissioned it. Even with such knowledge aligning historically, arguments for Beowulf being a rhetorical response to Alcuin would still be largely circumstantial. Similarly, the majority of the biblical references in Beowulf come from the Old Testament, an oversight I doubt any monastic scribe would make. Therefore, while Beowulf may have something to do with the Judeo-Christian tradition, the poem shows little connection between the Germanic hero and Jesus Christ. However, I do believe that if we accept a more generalized exigence, we can argue that the poet crafted Beowulf for a specific rhetorical purpose, and that is to provide guidance for a young man who could one day become a king. In support of this exigence, I offer the following. Words for nobility and royalty, eorl, atheling, kuning, occur nearly 8 times as frequently as words for any social class. The poem begins with the following words, What we gardena in jardagum theod kuninga thrum jefrunen, informing the audience that the poet's subject is of the great honorable deeds of the ancient kings of the people. From Skjoldskjefing to Hroðgar to Beowulf, the poem concerns itself with the actions of men who were, who are, or who will become king. And in the section known as Hroðgar's sermon, a section that's highly rhetorical in that it borrows from the style of the Anglo-Saxon sermon, the poet chooses to expound neither on the honorable pagan warrior nor the suffering, meek Christian servant, but on what makes a good king. With the education of a potential king as the exigence, the rhetorical reason for the poem's production, I will demonstrate now how the poet appropriated the rhetorical strategies of oral traditional heroic verse to craft a narrative that served this purpose. Specifically, the poet invoked the persuasive power of identification that is inherent throughout the episodic drama of heroic epic, to move the addressee to align his life, his values, and his beliefs with those that are deemed honorable and proper. And in this case, the 3 traits that are deemed honorable and proper for an Anglo-Saxon kuning are generosity, protectiveness, and faith. That the Beowulf poet drew heavily on the poetic and narrative traditions of the still largely oral Anglo-Saxon culture is well known, and as Tolkien argued, the poet took an active role in shaping the text. However, we've paid little attention to the rhetorical benefits from the strategic choice, and while an external figure commissioned the production, the poet strategically chose events from the myth cycle, of which we only do have 1 manuscript, in crafting Beowulf in a way that emphasized the honorable actions of mythic, legendary, kingly men. As Lord, Havelock, and Ong tell us, oral narratives and oral traditional narratives incorporate such heavy mythic figures because their monumental, memorable, and often public deeds allow the poet and the audience to organize and transmit experience, values, and ideas in a memorable form. Myth presents a culture with an arche, a beginning, a creation point, and a telos, an ending to which everything moves. and in the interim, it argues for a proper way to live. The audience would hear the story and infer the appropriate syllogisms, such as Beowulf fights courageously, Beowulf obtains glory and gold. Those who fight courageously obtain glory and gold. The audience then internalizes the syllogism, concluding that if I want glory and gold, I must fight courageously. This thought process does depict the primary persuasive technique used by oral storytellers, identification. The persuasive goal of identification, as Kenneth Burke tells us, requires the rhetor persuading person A that their interests and actions align with those of person B. Thus, if person A seeks gold, glory, and undying fame, the oral storyteller would craft a narrative that positively aligns cultural values with the acquisition of gold, glory, and undying fame. A poet may select episodes wherein those who fail to act according to cultural standards are not only denied those rewards, but are also shamed and mocked for such actions. More often than not, however, the actions presented are positive alignments with cultural values, and the repetition of those actions through the episodic nature of myth and legend builds a rhythm wherein people see causality and gain a sense of certainty. If you continue to act according to the proper tenets of our culture, you will continue to gain gold, glory, undying fame, and other honorable rewards. Through an analysis of the speech acts and their narrative context in Beowulf, I will argue that the poet crafted this episodic narrative focused upon the lives of kings and those who become kings to persuade his audience that the three most important traits for honorable and heroic culture in Christian and pagan times for kings were generosity, protectiveness, and faith. The primary trait which the poet wishes to persuade his audience to identify with is generosity. This is, of course, the giving of gifts, the giving of Harriet to those who follow you. It is the gift exchange and traditional culture that we see in all across the world. The gift exchange is reciprocal because those who receive the gifts are expected to perform service either in the future or they have already performed some service, and thus the gift is a reward. For defeating both Grendel and Grendel's mother, Hroðgar gives Beowulf enough treasure so that he will have nebithe anira god worlda vilna, when compared to the rewards that Hroðgar has given to men for lesser services. Beowulf praises Hroðgar for his generosity and requests that should he fall in battle, the treasure be sent to his own king Hroðgar, to show that Hroðgar was godne and a beagabritin, a good king and a dispenser of rings. Through the linking of the substantive godna with the kenning beagabritin, Beowulf articulates that Hroðgar is a good king through showing proper generosity. It is the identification of good with proper behavior. The ultimate expression of kingly generosity, in terms of rhetorical speech, occurs during Hroðgar's sermon. Hroðgar delivers this long speech the night before Beowulf and his men depart for their return trip back home. In this, he recounts the story of King Hermod, whom he describes as being a great warrior, but also Gusath Grumhudig, Nalus on Gupselith, Fada Beagus. As a result of his greed, Hermod lived without joy and without protectors. Hermod, a great warrior like Beowulf, but an ungenerous king, provides a very powerful negative example of kingship in that after giving this example, Hroðgar twice instructs Beowulf not to be like this, to live properly. Hroðgar then gives a long speech where he compares a good king to God. God is the good king. And then Hroðgar cements this by concrete action, giving further gifts to Beowulf. Generosity, significance, and reciprocity arise during the poem's climax, the dragon fight. As an old king, Beowulf takes 12 veterans and the young warrior Wiglaf to fight the dragon who is assaulting their homes. During the battle, the 12 veterans, who are the most elite warriors he has, turn tail and run. As part of the Germanic narrative tradition, Wiglaf breaks from the battle to go find them and make a speech, wherein he harangues them for failing both their king and their oaths to him. Ich that ma jeman tharwe me du thegun, thanawe je heten usum hlaferda, in bier sela, de us das beage jeaf, that way him tha Guthjavata, Gulden Wolden, Yif him Thusliku, Thear Violumpa, Helmus on Herr Swerd. Wiglaf continues recounting to them the gifts that Beowulf gave them as a group and to him individually before rejoining his king in battle. As Beowulf lays dying, his final actions reveal his boundless generosity. He instructs Wiglaf to take the dragon's hoard and distribute it to the people to see to their needs. And he follows this act of corporate generosity by removing the necklace from his own neck and handing it to Wiglaf as a gift for his service. Were the poet writing to a more literate audience, he would likely say, "Greater generosity hath no king than this." But because he was writing to a largely oral culture, he chose a very powerful, dramatic narrative to exemplify what generosity offers. And ultimately, the dragon fight itself is a metaphor for the importance of generosity. We know from Anglo-Saxon maxims that it is a dragon's job to hoard treasure. The dragon is uninterested in the world of humans until one single cup from its hoard is stolen. And if we brought into Germany and Scandinavia, we learn from the Nibelungen and the Volsunga saga that it was the greed to possess a magic ring that produced wealth that led Fafnir to kill his father and then run into a cave where he became transformed into a dragon. So the dragon for the Germanic people does have a representation of monstrous greed that can only be countered by the ultimate generosity. And thus we see kingly generosity does not limit itself to physical objects. Kings also grant protection to their people, and in the case of Beowulf, to the thief from another country who fled after angering a dragon and said, "Please protect me." A good king does protect his people, and while that statement seems obvious, any good leader protects his people, the poet's audience would likely be composed of young warriors who were trained to marshal their strength for individual, personal glory. The poet seeks to persuade those who could become king that when the crown sits upon the head, one must then channel that strength to the good of the people. Again, we return to the dragon fight for the ultimate example of kingly protection. You know, Beowulf he's been king for 50 years, he's probably in his 70s, but he still ventures out to protect his people from this monster. His role as protector becomes more apparent when the poet tells us that he takes a shield, which he has not worn in either of his two previous monster battles. Therefore, for this fight, Beowulf is choosing a defensive posture rather than a purely offensive stance. Two figures in the poem verbally cement the importance of the king as protector: Wiglaf and this unnamed Yattish woman who sings a dirge at Beowulf's funeral. In his final speech to the deserters, Wiglaf warns them that without a protective king, hard times will befall them because outsiders will not fear to invade. Londritis mot, thera mea burga, mona alwilk, ider chwerfen, suthen atherlingas, fearan yefrixian, fleam erwerna. At Beowulf's funeral, the unnamed woman echoes Wiglaf's fear when she laments, "That heo hura herum dagas, herd ondreda, warfula warn, weradus easan, hudo on haftnud." Both articulate the fear that without a strong, protective king, the people will suffer physical and emotional distresses. I place generosity and protectiveness first and second on my list for two reasons. One, they are the most common references to proper kingly behavior in the poem, and two, because the Beowulf poet highlights their importance through the use of metonymy, a rhetorical device that replaces the name of a thing with a characteristic intimately associated with that thing. In Germanic poetry, this is the kenning. The poet often refers to kings through their generosity as Sunches Brita, Sunchfan, Beagfan, Beaga Britain, givers of rings, givers of treasure, distributors of rings, distributors of treasure, who sit upon the gift seat, metonymically labeling kings as givers of treasure and rings as reward to those who serve them. And while we have the words of Wiglaf and the Yattish woman during and after the dramatized depiction of Beowulf's ultimate act of both generosity and protectiveness, throughout the poem, the poet labels kings as Leod Yabrugian, Eoda Schuldinga, Wiendra Leo, and Wedra Helm. the king as the armor of the people, that which protects them from external harm, emerges as a dominant metaphor through metonymic association. And again, were he writing for a fully literate audience, the poet may say, "Greater generosity hath no king than this, that he lay down his life to protect his people." But kings must be more than just generous and protective. They must possess faith. And I define faith as a belief in a transcendent ordering of the universe and a certainty that events will play out as ordained. The poet positively aligns faith with honorable action. As Beowulf prepares to fight Grendel, he sets the battle in terms of judicial ordeal, concluding with the words, "Gaeth a wyrd swa hio shall." Fate will go as it must, which is often repeated throughout the poem. The poet regularly refers to the Christian God as the method, the measurer, who measures and controls the lives of men. In fighting against Grendel's mother, the poet tells us, "On highly God, Yewaeld weak Sigur." It is God who will determine who is the winner of the battle. Other examples of faith through speech occur, as I have previously mentioned, when Hroðgar aligns the actions of good kings with those of Christian God. Though speaking specifically about generosity, his alignment of the physical mortal king with the spiritual immortal God reflects a belief that just as God is the ultimate arbiter of cosmological order in the universe, so too must a moral and mortal king serve a similar function on the earthly plane. And there is one example of negative faith and negative action. When Grendel attacks Heorot, we learn from the poet that the Scyldings revert to pagan ways, thus abandoning the Christian church in a way that he says that he fears will lead their children to hell. So positive actions are aligned with faith, negative actions become aligned with lack of faith. Of course, the final component of any traditional rhetorical analysis is to judge the effectiveness of the persuasive event. Sadly, given incomplete knowledge of the poem's exigence, we can make no claims about its effectiveness at its particular moment in history. However, it does seem fairly certain that the poem appears to have been produced for a royal audience. As such, the poet channeled the persuasive powers of the oral traditional narrative to persuade the audience to identify with larger-than-life legendary kings and align their actions with those that are positive and honorable for both heathen and Christian kings: generosity, protectiveness, and faith. A good, honorable king gives gifts to his people and, if necessary, will give his life to protect them. A good king possesses faith that the universe is ordered and serves as an earthly representation of that ordering in his deeds with other men. While we cannot know the specific events that led to the poem's composition, at least at this present time, I believe it is safe to argue that the poet crafted Beowulf to be a poetic, dramatized speculum athelinga, a mirror, potentially, for a future Anglo-Saxon king.